Chapter 3 The Supreme Custodian. It was 6 a.m. and still dark, 10 years to the day since Silas had found the bundle. At the end of corridor 223, behind the big black door with the number 16 stamped on it by the numerical patrol, the Heap household slept peacefully. Jenna lay curled up snugly in her small box bed that Silas had made for her from driftwood washed up along the river bank. The bed was built neatly into a big cupboard leading off a large room, which was in fact the only room that the Heaps possessed. Jenna loved her cupboard bed. Sarah had made some bright patchwork curtains that Jenna could draw around the bed to keep out both the cold and her noisy brothers. Best of all, she had a small window in the wall above her pillow that looked out onto the river. If Jenna couldn't sleep, she would gaze out of her window for hours on end, watching the endless variety of boats that made their way to and from the castle, and sometimes on clear, dark nights she loved to count the stars until she fell fast asleep. The large room was the place where all the Heaps lived, cooked, ate, argued, and occasionally did their homework, and it was a mess. It was stuffed full of 20 years' worth of clutter that had accumulated since Sarah and Silas had set up home together. There were fishing rods and reels, shoes and socks, rope and rat traps, bags and bedding, nets and knitting, clothing and cooking pots, and books, and yet more books. If you were foolish enough to cast your eye around the Heaps' room, hoping to find a space in which to sit, the chances were a book would have found it first. Everywhere you looked there were books, on sagging shelves, in boxes, hanging in bags from the ceiling, propping up the table and stacked up in such precariously high piles that they threatened to collapse at any moment. There were storybooks, herb books, cookery books, boat books, fishing books, but mainly there were the hundreds of magic books, which Silas had illegally rescued from school when magic had been banned a few years back. In the middle of the room was a large hearth from which a tall chimney snaked up into the roof. It held the remains of a fire, now grown cold, around which all 6 Heap boys and a large dog were asleep in a chaotic pile of quilts and blankets. Sarah and Silas were also fast asleep. They had escaped to the small attic space that Silas had acquired a few years back by the simple means of knocking up a hole through the ceiling, after Sarah had declared that she could no longer stand living with 6 growing boys in just one room. But amid all the chaos in the big room, a small island of tidiness stood out. A long and rather wobbly table was covered with a clean white cloth. On it were placed 9 plates and mugs, and at the head of the table was a small chair decorated with winter berries and leaves. On the table in front of the chair, a small present, carefully wrapped in colorful paper and tied with a red ribbon, had been placed ready for Jenna to open on her 10th birthday. All was quiet and still as the Heap household slept peacefully on through the last hours of darkness before the winter sun was due to rise. However, on the other side of the castle, in the palace of the custodians, sleep, peaceful or not, had been abandoned. The supreme custodian had been called from his bed and had, with the help of the night servant, hurriedly put on his black fur-trimmed tunic and heavy black and gold cloak, and he had instructed the night servant how to lace up his embroidered silk shoes. Then he himself had carefully placed a beautiful crown upon his head. The supreme custodian was never seen without the crown, which still had a dent in it from the day it had fallen from the queen's head and crashed to the stone floor. The crown sat crookedly on his slightly pointed bald head, but the night servant, being new and terrified, did not dare to tell him. The supreme custodian strode briskly down the corridor to the throne room. He was a small, rat-like man, with pale, almost colorless eyes, and a complicated goatee beard that he was in the habit of spending many happy hours tending. He was almost swamped by his voluminous cloak, which was heavily encrusted with military badges, and his appearance was made faintly ridiculous by his crooked and slightly feminine crown. But had you seen him that morning, you would not have laughed. You would have shrunk back into the shadows and hoped he would not notice you, for the supreme custodian carried with him a powerful air of menace. The night servant helped the supreme custodian arrange himself on the ornate throne in the throne room. He was then waved impatiently away and scuttled off gratefully, his shift nearly over. The chill morning air lay heavily in the throne room. The supreme custodian sat impassively on the throne, but his breath, which misted the cold air in small, quick bursts, betrayed his excitement. He did not have long to wait before a tall young woman, wearing the severe black cloak and deep red tunic of an assassin, walked briskly in and bowed low, her long, slashed sleeves sweeping across the stone floor. "The queenling, my lord. She has been found," the assassin said in a low voice. The Supreme Custodian sat up and stared at the assassin with his pale eyes. "Are you sure? I want no mistakes this time," he said menacingly. "Our spy, my lord, has suspected a child for a while. She considers her to be a stranger in her family. Yesterday our spy found out that the child is of the age." "What age exactly?" 10 years old today, my lord." "Really?" The Supreme Custodian sat back in the throne and considered what the assassin had said. "I have a likeness of the child here, my lord. I understand she is much like her mother, the ex-queen." From inside her tunic the assassin took a small piece of paper. On it was a skillful drawing of a young girl with dark violet eyes and long dark hair. The Supreme Custodian took the drawing. It was true. The girl did look remarkably like the dead queen. He came to a swift decision and clicked his bony fingers loudly. The assassin inclined her head. "My lord? Tonight, midnight, you are to pay a visit to— where is it? Room 16, corridor 223, my lord. Family name? Heap, my lord. Ah, take the silver pistol. How many in the family?" 9, my lord, including the child. "And 9 bullets in case of trouble. Silver for the child. And bring her to me. I want proof." The young woman looked pale. It was her first and only test. There were no second chances for an assassin. "Yes, my lord." She bowed briefly and withdrew, her hands shaking. In a quiet corner of the throne room, the ghost of Arthur Mella eased himself up from the cold stone bench he had been sitting on. He sighed and stretched his old, ghostly legs. Then he gathered his faded purple robes around him, took a deep breath, and walked out through the thick stone wall of the throne room. Outside he found himself hovering 60 feet above the cold ground in the dark morning air. Instead of walking off in a dignified manner as a ghost of his age and status really should, Arthur stuck his arms out like the wings of a bird and swooped gracefully through the falling snow. Flying was about the only thing that Arthur liked about being a ghost. Flying, or the lost art of flight, was something that modern extraordinary wizards could no longer do. Even Marcia, who was determined to fly, could do no more than a quick hover before crashing to the ground. Somewhere, somehow, the secret had been lost, but all ghosts could, of course, fly. And since he had become a ghost, Arthur had lost his crippling fear of heights, and had spent many exciting hours perfecting his acrobatic moves. But there wasn't much else about being a ghost that he enjoyed, and sitting in the throne room where he had actually become one, and consequently where he had had to spend the first year and a day of his ghosthood, was one of his least favorite occupations. But it had to be done. Arthur made it his business to know what the custodians were planning and to try and keep Marcia up to date. With his help, she had managed to stay one step ahead of the custodians and keep Jenna safe, until now. Over the years since the death of the Queen, the Supreme Custodian had become more and more desperate to track down the princess. Every year he would make a long and much-dreaded trip to the Badlands, where he would have to report his progress to a certain extraordinary wizard turned necromancer. Dom Daniel. It was Dom Daniel who had sent the first assassin to kill the queen, and it was Dom Daniel who had installed the Supreme Custodian and his henchmen to scour the castle in search for the princess. For while the princess remained in the castle, Dom Daniel dared not come near. And so every year the Supreme Custodian would promise Dom Daniel that this year he would be successful. This year he would get rid of the queenling, and at last deliver the castle up to its rightful master, Dom Daniel. And this was why, as Arthur left the throne room, the Supreme Custodian wore what his mother would have called a silly grin on his face. At last he had done the job he was sent to do. Of course, he thought, his silly grin changing to a smug smile, it was only due to his superior intelligence and talent that he had discovered the girl. But it wasn't. It was due to a bizarre stroke of luck. When the Supreme Custodian took over the castle, one of the first things he did was to ban women from the courthouse. The ladies' washroom, which was no longer needed, had eventually become a small committee room. During the past bitterly cold month, the committee of the custodians had taken to meeting in the former ladies' washroom, which had the great advantage of a wood-burning stove, rather than the cavernous custodian committee room, where the chill wind whistled through and froze their feet to blocks of ice. And so, unknowingly, for once the custodians were one step ahead of Arthur Mella. As a ghost, Arthur could only go to the places he had been to in his lifetime, and as a well-brought-up young wizard, Arthur had never set foot in a lady's washroom in his life. The most he was able to do was hover outside, waiting, just as he had done when he was alive and courting Judge Alice Nettles. It had been late one particularly cold afternoon, a few weeks ago, when Arthur had watched the custodian committee take themselves into the ladies' washroom. The heavy door with ladies, still visible in faded gold letters, was slammed behind them, and Arthur hovered outside with his ear to the door, trying to hear what was going on. But try as he might, he was not able to hear the committee decide to send their very best spy, Linda Lane, with her interest in herbs and healing, to live in room 17, corridor 223, right next door to the Heaps. And so neither Arthur nor the Heaps had any idea that their new neighbor was a spy, and a very good one, too. As Arthur Mella flew through the snowy air pondering how to save the princess, he absent-mindedly turned 2 almost perfect double loops before he dived swiftly through the drifting snowflakes to reach the golden pyramid that crowned the wizard tower. Arthur landed gracefully on his feet. For a moment he stood perfectly balanced on the tips of his toes. Then he raised his arms above his head and spun around, faster and faster, until he started to sink slowly through the roof and down into the room below, where he misjudged his landing and fell through the canopy of Marcia Overstrand's 4-poster bed. Marcia sat up in a fright. Arthur was sprawled on her pillow, looking embarrassed. "Sorry, Marcia. Very ungallant. Well, at least you haven't got your curlers in." "My hair is naturally curly, thank you, Arthur," said Marcia crossly. "You might have waited until I had woken up." Arthur looked serious, and became slightly more transparent than usual. "I'm afraid, Marcia," he said heavily, "this won't wait."